I'm Professor Atul Pathak from Toulouse, France, and I'm happy to share with you the content of a session we had, the All You Need to Know session about the future and the statement about renal denervation. I have the pleasure to be today with a very distinguished panel, Professor Michel Azizi from Paris, Hôpital Européen Georges Pompidou, who is a very famous hypertension specialist and also involved in clinical trials. Professor Mel Lobo from London, hypertension specialist and involved in a lot of clinical trials also with invasive approaches. And Professor Felix Mahfoud, a well-known pioneer in the field of renal denervation from Homburg, Saarland, Germany. So I would like to start first with you, Professor Azizi. You've been the first author and the PI of the study called DENER-HTN, published recently in the Lancet, which is a landmark trial in the field because it's a positive trial. And I would like to have some comments and some explanation about what was this trial about and what were the major results, please.
Thank you very much, Atul, for your question. The aim of this trial, which was initiated just after Simplicity HTN2, which was the first randomized trial evaluated renal denervation using the radiofrequency catheter, Simplicity Flex catheter, was to assess, let's say, in a subpopulation of patients referred to very specialized hypertension clinics, whether renal denervation added to an optimized treatment, which is recommended by guidelines, could have an added value compared to optimized treatment alone. So we set up this trial. This is very important in the network of European Society of Hypertension clinics, which are these clinics are normally designed by and also categorized by the European Society of Hypertension. And when we designed this trial, our aim was to have the most precise resistant hypertensive population, well defined by ABPM, using a very standardized treatment after verifying that patients do not have secondary hypertension. And after a very extensive workup, and this extensive workup makes us the thing very complicated since we had to screen 1,400 patients to finally to randomize 100 patients, so it shows you the complexity of this process. Then we randomized the patient in an open trial in 2 arms, optimized treatment alone with a very standardized and very strict treatment algorithm, and the other arm, renal denervation plus the same standardized antihypertensive treatment. And we followed regularly the patient on the monthly basis with home blood pressure monitoring, and the treatment were added taking into account the results of the home blood pressure monitoring at each visit. So this step care approach, finally, for those who need to arrive at the last step, patient could be treated with 7 antihypertensive drugs. This was a superiority trial. We wanted to demonstrate whether renal denervation added to this type of treatment could have an additional benefit. And the primary endpoint for the first time in this type of trials, like for pharma trials, was ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. And what we have observed is that when you give a similar treatment to this patient in these 2 arms at the same speed, with the same step, and you always introduce the same treatment at the same time, at the end, after 6 months of follow-up, you find a difference, a significant difference of 6 millimeters of mercury in daytime and nighttime and 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure on systolic blood pressure, which is significant and which correspond to a potential benefits in terms of cardiovascular prevention if on the long run this blood pressure lowering effect is maintained. So this is the main result of the study. And I think it's very important, and we have seen through the other trials, that when you don't control the antihypertensive treatment, then it's very difficult with this type of therapy to truly interpret the efficacy of the therapy when drugs or doses or classes of antihypertensive treatments are changing during the trial.
Thank you very much for this nice explanation. And so moving to you, Professor Mel Lobo, you've been the first author of another Lancet paper regarding another way to decrease blood pressure, which is not sympathomodulation, so maybe another approach for other type of patients. So would you like to share with us the major results of your trial, and maybe also comment about what are the unmet needs in the field of device therapy for patients with hypertension?
Thank you, Atul. The ROCKS coupler study was designed with the idea of exploiting the approach of a mechanical aspect of the circulation, targeting a mechanical aspect of the circulation rather than a sympathomodulatory approach, as you mentioned. So here we placed a nitinol stent-like device which creates a fixed caliber anastomosis between the external iliac artery and vein to reduce blood pressure. And we chose a population of patients with uncontrolled hypertension who were really at the end of the line in terms of options for blood pressure treatment. And we saw very substantial reductions in measures of both office blood pressure and ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, the two co-primary endpoints that were highly significant with no real change in blood pressure reduction in the control limb. And what was interesting is that during the study, patients in the control limb by and large increased their antihypertensive medications and had a number of hypertension-related events such as hospital admissions with blood pressure crises, whereas people in the ROCKS coupler limb on the whole reduced their antihypertensive drugs, and they had very much less in the way of hypertension-related events. The important thing to bear in mind, therefore, is that we used an intention to treat analysis in the study and perhaps underestimated the true degree of blood pressure lowering in the coupler by intention to treat. Now, an important side effect of the coupler that has become apparent is that about 1/3 of the patients will expect to develop upstream stenosis of the external iliac vein, probably due to turbulence from the increased flow related to the coupler being opened. And in those patients, they require a further procedure to open this, which is a venous stent. However, this was achieved relatively easily during the study without complication, and those patients did actually restore blood pressure control and reduce lower limb swelling that accompanied the stenosis in the first place. So I think what the coupler study is telling us is not that we have a new treatment for hypertension that's ready to come to clinical practice, but that we have to refocus our attention a little bit. And whilst we have a raft of sympathomodulatory approaches that I think are all highly interesting and worth further investigating, we must also not forget that a stiff circulation also poses a challenge in its own right. And it's important to recognize that within the ROCKS population, there were a number of patients that had prior renal denervation that had not responded and were recruited into the study. And again, they exhibited quite substantial blood pressure lowering in the active limb, whereas in the control limb, they had no blood pressure lowering at all. So perhaps this is telling us that patients with stiff circulation may respond better to mechanical approaches. And I think this speaks to your second point of where is the field going and what are the future outcomes. And I think where this leaves us is that we have to have a greater awareness of hypertension phenotypes. And that hasn't necessarily helped in the past with drug therapy of hypertension, but in terms of device therapy, these are expensive approaches with added risk compared to pharma, and therefore I think phenotyping will become more important. And the challenges of doing clinical studies in these groups of patients are enormous, because to undertake trials such as DENER-HTN with Professor Azizi's group was an incredible effort. But I think it's important that we undertake them in this fashion, because otherwise we will never really understand the true effect of the device and the safety of the device.
Thank you very much, Mel. And moving to Professor Felix Mahfoud, a well-known person in the milieu of renal denervation, and who is the first author of a paper which has just been released today in the European Heart Journal, which is basically putting into perspective kind of clinical consensus. So Felix, what are your comments and what would you like to share with the audience about this, I think, important paper opening the path for the future?
Yeah. So, you know, with respect to preclinical evidence, we have a body that indicates that whenever you target sympathetic nerves in hypertension and different comorbidities of hypertension, that you have beneficial effects long-term of this approach. Although, and we discussed the clinical evidence in part, which is available at the moment, we have conflicting results. We have open label registries and at the moment 4 randomized controlled trials that at least support the concept of targeting sympathetic nerves. And we do have, on the other hand, the Simplicity-HTN-3 trial, which was a pivotal trial conducted in the United States, which did not meet the primary efficacy endpoint. So there is a kind of a crossroad now where we have to move the field forward, and in which way. And so we decided, and we convened a group of European experts, you were all 3 part of it, of European experts in December last year, where we put all these people together in a room, different specialities, different viewpoints on renal denervation and on the problem of uncontrolled hypertension. And what came out is a paper, a consensus document, a clinical consensus paper of these experts in not only hypertension, but again, different aspects, all of them dealing with hypertensive patients. So we are talking about the procedure itself, the methods that need to be applied in future trial. Professor Azizi already talked about standardization in future clinical trials, how important that is, the right study population. We talked about sham procedure and the need of sham potentially, or other control group that will help to overcome the problem of adding noise to the data actually. And we also talked about socioeconomic aspects long-term, which are very important for healthcare providers. So if you're interested in the field, I recommend reading it. I think it's a strong paper, a nice guidance for the field and for future investigations in patients with uncontrolled hypertension who need potentially interventional approaches.
Thank you. So I would like to thank first our distinguished panel, and maybe just as bullet point, invite you to read maybe first the paper by Michel Azizi group, showing for the first time that renal denervation in a very controlled way, with very strict methodology, is able to bring an added value in terms of reduction of blood pressure in a very specific population, done in a very controlled fashion. Then read maybe the other Lancet paper written by Mel Lobo, showing the beneficial effects of a new approach, and maybe opening also the path for personalization of the therapy according to the phenotype of the patient. And finally read the paper authored by Felix Mahfoud about what could be the next step, what could be the future trials in the field. Thank you for your attention.